I'm going to start by reading a poem, quite a sad poem about the church, and I'm going to end up with a poem, a very positive poem about the church, and in the middle we're going to have the talk. So I just want you to feel the difference from one thing to another, all right? It's called A Closed Church. Silent the bell, it tolls no more. The church is just a shell, closed is the door. Closed by people with common sense, cold indifference, lack of pence. A lone silhouette on a bleak Pennine top. Do they ever pause and stop to think of the church in its prime? Christmas, Easter, harvest time. Often have I climbed those meadows steep when winter snow lay white and deep, to sing my praise of Saviour's birth, goodwill to all, peace on earth. The lark soars high his song to sing, to welcome yet another spring. The soft wind whispers in the grass, another hill, another cross. Beneath granite, stone, and earthen mound, deep within that hallowed ground, lie father, mother, sister, friend. What to them this permissive modern trend? Have we betrayed their loving trust? Will there again blossom from the dust a brave new church proudly planned? If not, I pray they will understand. Excuse me. Well, I've slightly arrogantly called this talk, or this mission, Pope Francis and How to be a 21st Century Catholic. And every time I go to write it, I've read something else by Francis, and how do I get that in? So this is not a perfect exposition of Francis' theology. It's where I'm at with it. And I have to say something at the beginning. It sounds terribly arrogant of me, but every time I read Francis's works or hear his homilies, I think, that's what I've been believing, but you say it so brilliantly. So I've got this real sense of resonance with Francis. And I've divided the 3 days into the 3 M's. Mission, mercy, and money. Okay? That's a rather twisted way of looking at it. I'm going to look at mission and the church today. Tomorrow I'm going to look at mercy, joy, and the Beatitudes. And on Friday I'm going to look at things to do with economics and the environment, etc. Okay? Yeah? What did I say? Friday? Wednesday, sorry. I can try and fit in another couple of days if you want. So, mission and the church. Pope Francis has 4, not only 4, but 4 interesting images of the church that I want to explore and that he often refers to. The first is church as mother. Secondly, a poor church for the poor. Thirdly, a missionary church. And fourthly, the church as a field hospital. All right? None of these views is in and of themselves new. But in Pope Francis's words and actions, they take on an effective and affecting newness of life. We will come to see over the course of this mission, hopefully, that Pope Francis is in real continuity with his predecessors, from Pope St. John the 23rd all the way to Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. He often uses a cry that is well known from his native Argentina. And he uses this little cry often with the youth. It's "Háganlo." Any of you who know Spanish might know that can be quite a tough little thing to say. But the way he says is, make a mess, shake things up. Make a mess, shake things up. Perhaps we need to keep this in mind throughout this mission to see that Francis is shaking things up, not changing them. He's refreshing things. I see it sort of like, you know, you've got a lovely roaring fire in the grate, and then it goes down, doesn't it? You know, as the clinkers get in the way and the embers are there, and you have to go and griddle it out. Yeah, shake it up a bit and get the rubbish to fall out, and the air can get at it and revive it, and the flames go again, yes? Okay. Isn't that also very similar to John the 23rd, when he launched the council in 1961? Some of you remember that extraordinary bombshell. The institutional church at that time did not want a council. What is this old boy doing, they said. Literally those words. What does this old boy think he's doing? And if you remember when he was asked, what are you doing, Father? He said, I'm opening up the windows to let the wind come through. And of course, we understand that as being the Holy Spirit, the breath of God coming through. So, and I quite often when I go into my office, Patty will concur with this, look at my desk, and I have this little prayer to myself. God bless this mess. Yeah? Especially when it's of my own creation. There we go. So let's look at the first one, the church as mother. This is an ancient title and well-established theology, going back to St. Cyprian, St. Gregory Nazianzus, and St. Augustine, to name but three. Now, Pope St. John the 23rd, just before the council, put out an encyclical called Mater et Magistra, Mother and Teacher. And it was about how is the church responding to the realities of the times. It's what we call an anniversary encyclical because it was in 1961, and it refers back to Rerum Novarum of Leo the 13th in 1891, responding to the issues of social, economic and political reality facing the world after the Industrial Revolution. And remember, he was the prisoner in the Vatican and all those kind of things. Revolutions throughout Europe from about 1848. It had all the Napoleonic Wars and all that stuff. It was the Franco-Prussian War was just about to happen. He needed to speak out about the social and the economic and the political realities that were happening. And John does it in Mater Magistra. Okay, Pius the Ninth had done it in Quadragesima Anna, 40 years on, also this sort of review of where is the church. And John in Mater Magistra portrays the church as mother and teacher of all nations, responsible for the care and guidance of God's people. As Christ did, so too does the church. It was an anniversary encyclical, I've spoken of that. These took up 4 key points: the dignity of work, just wages, the right to private property, and the importance of the family in the social fabric of the world, of society. John spoke a great deal about the excellent progress that had been made. He was really very positive about the progress of much that had happened. But he also was very scathing of the desperate plight of the growing number of those living in extreme poverty, while only a few live in relative or even gross luxury. And it asked telling questions about judging the success of a nature by its military might or its buoyant GNP. I'm not saying these things aren't important, but Is that the criteria? But we make a decision about real progress for humanity? But how does a nation really advance and provide for the prosperity of its people? Real questions. These are motherly questions, we will come to. Indeed, Blessed Paul VI takes up John's the theme and says, when he speaks to the United Nations, do you remember? He speaks very carefully and very clearly. He gives them the exposition that the root cause of the problems of the world are inequality. And he says, if you want peace in the world, he's the one who said, never again, war never again. And he pounded the podium. Never again. If you want peace, work for justice, he said. Okay? And this is really what Francis is talking about with regards to the motherhood of the church, but in a very interesting way. He calls for Christian brotherhood and cooperation between nations and within nations. It's not against wealth. And that money, if you said it was against, so if you say things are, the church teaches against money. No, it doesn't teach against money. It doesn't teach against wealth. It teaches the biblical quotation, which is the love of it, which is the root of greed, which is the root of acquisition, which is the root of I've got stuff and you haven't. It's biblical. Yeah? Biblical. Because with greed comes oppression, economic oppression, whether you intend it to not or not. Okay? Mater et Magistra was loved and loathed with equal measure when it came out. Some who agreed with the motherhood bit, but in a sentimental way, but they couldn't take the teacher bit. They said, Mater si, Magistra no. But Pope Francis is definitely in the church in both camps. Not just a mother and a teacher, but mothers teach. It is part of the motherly idea that you raise your children and you teach them. Fathers also, but we're talking about mother here. He looks at it in the way mums mother. In a homily in September 2015, he says, our Mother Mary and our Mother Church both know how to caress their children and show tenderness. That's a different starting point, isn't it? Okay? To think of the church without that motherly feeling is to think of a rigid association or institution without warmth, resulting in orphans. He has a very image-laden way of speaking to us. Yeah? We do not become Christians on our own, but we are nurtured by the people of God, the church. So the comparison has been made for us. Our Blessed Mother bears, nurtures, and raises Jesus. Holy Mother does the same for all Christians, and indeed for all people who listen. It raises us through baptism, nurtures us through the Holy Eucharist, and teaches us through the gospel. It's the same thing. The church is and must be, therefore, emotionally available and responsive, physically present and practical, and instructional and liberating through that. For Francis, ignorance is not bliss, especially ignorance of the Gospels. Yeah? Ignorance of the Gospels. That's why we must be reading our texts all the time. So Francis is very much in line with John the 23rd and indeed his predecessors. The church must be ready to teach by its word and witness like Mary our Mother does. And Mary our Mother is also steadfast, hope-filled and patient, like all mothers have to be. And she's also defensive of her children and protective against Satan's evil and danger. So that sentimentalism that sometimes creeps into our relationship with Mary is not what Francis is about. And all of you here who have been mothers, and dads too, but all of you who've been mothers, you know that mothering is not a sentimental game, it's hard work. Yeah? And it involves being defensive at times, it being steadfast, being very patient. Yeah? All those things. This is the motherhood that Francis is on about. Not, with all due respect, that slightly sweet and sickly saccharine stuff that we sometimes hear about Our Lady. No, Mary's mother, not just the sweet little lady. Got to get it real. That protecting against the evil in the world reminds us very much of the statue of the Immaculate Conception, which always has Our Lady with her foot crushing the serpent's head. Yeah? She is the new Eve, restoring things. Yeah? Very much that's the image there. All right. But so too the Church stands up against all evil, institutional and personal. It teaches and acts for the spiritual and practical betterment of its members and those who are not its members. There was a very interesting Archbishop of Canterbury from the Anglican Communion who said, the Church is the club that exists solely for the benefit of its non-members. Interesting, that. Worth just thinking about. Okay? And how does the Church do all this spiritual and practical betterment? Through nurturing us all to grow ever deeper into the mystery of God's love, by going out to the margins with the light of the gospel. Only the other day we had in the gospel, make sure that your lamp is on a lampstand so it can be seen, the light can be effective. You don't hide it. The second of these explorations of the Church, the way that he talks about them, is a poor church for the poor. Again, this phrase is a description of the Church that is in line with the teaching that's already been there. Lumen Gentium, the constitution on the Church from Vatican II, I'm going to quote in a moment, but do you realize that it took 2,000 years of being Church before the Church actually wrote down what it understood itself to be? We had never written a constitution. We had used things like, that we are the body of Christ, and the Pauline thing, Jesus is the groom and we're the bride. And it had lots of things like that. But this is when it sat down and wrote about who it was. And thank goodness it did, because it put to bed what was hoped was for by the institutional curial guys at the time, which was a nice definition of there's the Pope, there's the bishops, and everybody does what they're told. It flipped it. The pilgrimage people of God. And bishops and priests and the Pope all are there to serve and keep it all in balance, with the Pope like a fulcrum at the bottom of a thing. It's a very different image, isn't it, than a top-down. So, in number 8, paragraph 3, it says this. So listen carefully to this. Just as Christ carried out the work of redemption in poverty and persecution, so the Church is called to follow the same route that it might communicate the fruits of salvation to all. Did you notice I said route instead of route? I'm learning. There we go. Christ Jesus, though he was by nature God, emptied himself, taking on the nature of a slave. Paul to the Philippians. And being rich became poor for our sakes. 2 Corinthians. Thus the Church although it needs human and other resources to carry out its mission, it is not set up to seek earthly glory, but to proclaim, even by its own example, humility and self-sacrifice. Christ was sent by the Father to bring good news to the poor, to heal the contrite of heart, to seek and to save what was lost. All of these come from Luke. Similarly, the church encompasses with love all who are afflicted with human suffering, and in the poor and afflicted sees the image of the poor and suffering founder. It does all it can to relieve their need, and in them it strives to serve Christ. Okay. Again, in Gaudium et Spes, which was another constitution, this time the first ever pastoral constitution, so obviously it's talking about something that will grow and develop and change in time, begs the questions about the value of technological and other progress. If interpersonal relationships between individuals and between peoples and between nations are diminished, and the advances only benefit the few. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. A little side issue. There's a lot of discussion that we should need to have some another one of these kind of documents on social media, the internet and everything. The internet is by equal measure a wonderful thing, but also it can be very, very damaging. Okay? You don't need to go to a shop, a little newsagent somewhere, and look on the top shelf anymore. You can dial it up and it'll be in your home. All those images that we shouldn't be seeing. The pornographic world, for instance. You know? It comes right into our homes. Pope Paul VI, in Populorum Progressio in 1967, quotes the first letter of John. If someone who has the riches of this world sees his brother in need and closes his heart to them, how does the love of God abide in him? See also the story of the rich man with Lazarus at the door and the Last Judgment parable in Matthew 25. I believe that this is a key point for Pope Francis. The Church's business is to help people understand that the love of God abides in us. All of us. All of us. Not just the Catholics, not just the Christians, but all of humanity. God abides in us. And the Church must constantly root its doctrine, and that's root rather than root its doctrine in the pastoral realities of this world, and inequality leading to such abject poverty is the most pressing reality. Okay. Pope St. John Paul II, in his anniversary document on Rerum Novarum, which he did 100 years after, hence it's called Centimus Annus, the 100th year, or 100 years, says something very important that we have to be very clear about. And he says, it is not wrong to want to live better. People say the churches want us to sort of live a boring, humdrum, partyless life. And, you'd have nothing, But no, Saint John Paul II tells us there's nothing wrong in wanting to live better. What is wrong is a style of life which is presumed to be better when it is directed towards having rather than being. Francis really challenges this possessiveness and acquisitiveness. He calls for us to empty ourselves and rid ourselves of those possessions and primarily attitudes that close us off from each other and from the plight in the world, that make us insensitive fills us up a bit like sort of indigestion, so that we're just unable to respond and help. He's not saying that, having nice things is wrong. But what he's saying is that the attitude that goes with it is this acquisitive. I've got something here, building up there. Because what you're going to have to do, you're going to have to build a wall around your house, put barbed wire on it, and put glass on the top of it. And you become all about me and my stuff and there, and you never go out. And that's what Francis is asking us to do, to go out. We'll look at some of this stuff again tomorrow and Wednesday. Pope Francis is calling upon us as individuals, but also as the Church, to continue to deepen our understanding and commitment to the preferential option for the poor, which was one of the great statements of Vatican II, and it's a biblical reality. It comes from the Gospels and was stressed by Vatican II. He's also asking the Church to be poor in its own lifestyle. As we know, Francis has a real concern about excessive worldliness in some quarters and aspects of the Church and its life. He is a decentralizer. He is moving the Church towards one of the lost ideas of the Council, the collegiality of the bishops, which is an ancient idea, but got slightly sidelined when Leo XIII at Vatican I took the other idea that went parallel, and we'll see why this is an important thing in a minute when we look at something, okay, and got the bishops to make him infallible. That comes from Vatican I. It's only about 140 years old, that actual dogma. It had its antecedents and ideas there, but also at the same time this collegiality, the bishops working together. The bishops have to come together in councils to sort out the issues, to talk it through. He's handing back to Episcopal conferences like the American Bishops' Conference, the English Bishops' Conference, the French Bishops' Conference, certain aspects of the control of the life of the Church, because he says, you, the bishops who live in Argentina or Kenya or Japan, know the realities of those places better than a few guys living in some palace in the Vatican. If the Church is trying to look after 2 billion people, a small handful of Monsignori in the Curia are not going to be responsive in the way that it needs to be. So he's handing that back, pastoral responsibility, to the bishops. They are, of course, the pastors. Pastor means shepherds. What do they hold? Shepherd's crook. He's also very anti-clericalism and careerism in the Church, especially amongst the clergy and most specifically the Curia. We all know he wants the bishops and priests to get their shoes muddy and to know the smell of their sheep. No. He does not have much truck also with Baroque accretions in the liturgical life and in the life of the ceremonial of the Vatican. He's a great adherent of the noble simplicity of the Church's rites and the need for them to be pastorally sensitive. This is why, for instance, he has returned the control of translations back to bishops' conferences. He broke with tradition in liturgical things by washing the feet of prisoners on his first Holy Thursday. Up until that point, it had been developed in the last 50, 60, 70 years that the 12 who would have their feet washed by the Holy Father were 12 seminarians from the Roman seminaries. And I have to tell you, the infighting to get your kids as one of the 12 was not a healthy thing. Nope, none of that. What does he do? He goes to one of the prisons outside Rome, and also he hits on the head. He washes the feet of men and women and non-Christians. The church is in service to all. Okay? Remember, Peter says, if you, you'll never wash with it. If I can't wash your feet, says Jesus, you'll have nothing to do with me. Peter says, then wash all of me. Well, then translate that to what Francis is doing. He's washing the world's feet. And we as the church have to do that. That's the pastoral sensitivity he's getting at. That's what a mother does. Make sure her kids are clean and catered for and looked after. So that mother thing comes in here too. I remember in England there was a whole debate about, this, and there was a liturgist wrote, oh, well, it has to be men because they were apostles and we do the mimetic theology of liturgy, blah, 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 blah. Gone. In one act. That's what he doesn't like. Getting all terribly self-reverential about the liturgy as well as other things. So that it's looking inward, it's not looking out. All of this is so that the church will not be hypocritical. What did we have today in the reading? Those of you who went to Mass this morning? I'm not saying that's very naughty of you if you didn't go to Mass, but it was that great, great thing on hypocrisy. Don't talk about the splinter in your eye when you've got a great log in your own. This is where Francis is at. Don't talk about the problems if we're living in palaces and episcopal mansions and all that sort of stuff. Okay? The poor church for the poor is also behind Pope Francis' strong sense of non-judgmentalism. Only the other day, again, we had, judge not that you be not judged. Okay, and we all remember, my goodness, on a plane in a press conference when he was asked about issues to do with gay marriage, what was his response? Who am I to judge? Now, people leapt onto that, as people will do, to say, oh, he's changing the church's teaching. No, he's not changing any of the teaching. He's talking about how are you relating to these people? Are you casting them out? Are you shoving them to the margins by the way you respond to them? Just for one example. There you are. In fact, recent statements that he has made have made it very clear that he's not changing anything. Okay? What he is saying here is that we should not use the church's doctrine as an insensitive tool or even a weapon against those we don't agree with. Nor must we take the example of Christ in the so he says, no, we must take the example of Christ in the Gospels as our start point. In all these encounters with others, and enter into dialogue that will accompany and allow growth rather than distrust and alienation, orphaning. You're cut off. You're disposed of. A poor church for the poor is about opening doors to new ways of thinking and acting the gospel. I'm reminded, when I was in England, I served on the Conference of Major Superiors, and we have a conference every year, and we got Bishop Kevin Dowling, the Bishop of Rustenburg in South Africa, to come and speak. This is a bishop who was following Francis's heart before Francis was the Pope. Bishop Kevin lives in a small little flat in an AIDS hospital. And when he's not going out around his diocese, he's working in the hospital, being the chaplain, going out to those. And I can remember him speaking about this. So I have to compose myself because we were all in tears. I mean, 250 mother superiors and religious superiors of men's orders, like abbots and stuff. He said this: when a young mother comes to you dying of AIDS, holding in her arms her newborn who is also dying of AIDS, there is absolutely no point in talking about the Church's doctrine on sexual morality. This is a poor bishop who smells his sheep and is poor for them so that he can accompany them in their need. We help the poor and those on the margins and those imprisoned in the inequalities of socio-political economic structures by first of all acknowledging them and being there for them so that we can journey with them along the way to enter into the struggle with them. The Church can't do this if she walks away at the end of the day into a nice, comfy palace or mansion. The third image builds up on that is the idea of the Church as a missionary church, not a proselytizing church, a missionary church. This in many ways is Pope Francis's main concern. Evangelium Gaudium, his apostolic exhortation of 2013, this one here, Evangelium Gaudium, is his agenda for the Church in the 21st century, like his manifesto or his route map or blueprint for the way we've got to go. And look at the title, The Joy of the Gospel. The Joy of the Gospel. Evangelii Gaudium. If you haven't got a copy, go online, buy yourself one. You'll have hours of wonderful reading before you go to bed every night. Every time I open it, wonderful. It's just a treasure, a real treasure. And if you remember, when he first came to the papacy, Benedict had already done an encyclical on love, an encyclical on hope, but he hadn't finished the one on faith. So, so the first thing that Francis did was to do the one on faith. Okay, the light of faith. Do you see how light, shedding the light of the gospel? This idea is a big one. We've got to go and take the gospel out there, you know. Not saying I've got it, so I know all about it. Thank you very much. Okay, but Evangelium Gaudium is his big one. Okay, not the only one, but the big one from the beginning. He is in this in line with the thrust of John Paul II and Pope Benedict's call for a new evangelization. He says in number 27, alongside the option of the poor, I dream of a missionary option. That is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything. He's not being specific, he's saying everything. If the gospel is worth anything, it can do everything. Because if it can't, then it's only for a specific few, and we're lost. That is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the Church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably challenged for evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. Notice what he is not saying. He's not saying change all those things. He's just use these things to get the gospel out there. Yeah? Finding new ways. He says that the renewal of structures demanded by pastoral conversion can only be understood in this light, as part of an effort to make them more mission-oriented, to make ordinary pastoral activity on every level more inclusive and open, to inspire in pastoral workers a constant desire to go forth, and in this way to elicit a positive response from all whom Jesus summons to friendship with himself. What does Jesus say in his great prayer in John? I call you friends, slaves no longer. I call you friends. If you do the will of my Father. And the will of your Father is to love. We'll see a bit more about that tomorrow. This is France's real agenda. We must break out of our cozy world of insulated Christianity and go and make friends. And in doing so, bring them to our best friend, Jesus. You've all done it. You've got different friends from different sort of walks of your life, and you sort of have a party and say, oh, hello, have you met John? Oh, I work with John. And they become friends. We do it all the time. We have to do it with the poorest of the poor, the marginalized, the broken, the sinner, because we're not going to judge them. Because they're, by the grace of God, go us, huh? He quotes his predecessor, Benedict. He says, I never tire of repeating those words of Benedict XVI, which take us to the very heart of the gospel. Benedict says, listen to this, because I'm going to say it twice. This is Benedict. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. Let me say that again. This is Francis quoting Benedict. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. Our sweet Lord. Francis is asking us to realize the vision of Vatican II. Pope John called the council. Paul steered the council through. John Paul II, bless him, only lived 30 days, so he just smiled upon it. St. John Paul II took it out to the world and called for it to be a remedy of the world's ills, especially between the East and the West. And the walls came tumbling down. And Benedict reminded us of its heart and the scandal of Christian disunity in a time of challenge. And Francis is now asking us to realize the council in mission to the world, especially the poor. And his focus is not east-west, that was JP2, his is south-north. Just look at it. Who's in the south? Most of Africa, South America, where the poor are in their teeming billions. And in the north, yes, there is poverty in the north. I'm not saying there isn't. Okay, but there is far more prosperity in the north than the south. And so when John Paul is concerned about the East-West divide, which put us into a Cold War and all that, and remember he condemned both communism and capitalism, as being erroneous because they end up being insensitive and causing inequality and injustice. Francis is about the south-north. And of course he would be. He's come from Argentina. Okay? Apart from a few years trying to do his doctorate, he's always lived in the south. That's where he smelt the sheep that he was called to lead. This is a call for engagement with the world, not withdrawal from it, as some right-wing commentators misguidedly recently caricaturized Pope Benedict's view. Francis comes from a theological background of Ignatian discernment, engagement, and apostolic zeal, doing stuff. Bless him, and he's wonderful at it. Benedict was an academic theologian. Different background. Francis was never able to finish his doctorate in Europe on the theology of Romano Guardini, which certainly still to this day influences him. He was asked to go back and be the provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina at the time of the dictators. The Jesuit superior, Father General said, "You must go, I need you to be there, you're the man for this job." So he had to give up doing his doctorate. Some people say Francis is a theological lightweight. Oh no, that would be completely misunderstand Francis. So who is this Guardini? Guardini taught about, and this is technical, but it's absolutely important for us to grasp if we're to understand what Francis is asking us to do about the way we must live out our Catholicism in the world today. Guardini taught about dynamic tension in the dialogue of ideas. Basically, two seemingly, if not genuinely, conflicting ideas can and should be held in a dynamic tension in a multicultural world. One side does not date or reject or denigrate the other side's views, but enters into an open dialogue, discernment, and accompaniment with them. But also, the two are not subject to some form of the famous thing, the Hegelian dialectic, when you have a thesis and an antithesis and you thrust them together to get a new synthesis, a new thesis, a new synthesis, which actually neither side really own, and they can start using it as the weapon to say, well, we agreed this and you're not doing it, so I'm going to press you with it. That's Hegelian dialectic's endpoint. That's slightly caricaturing it, but you know what I mean. Okay? Where have we got to? The Christian has to shine, and how we do this, he says, when we are walking in this dynamic tension, the role of the Christian is to shed the light of the gospel on that reality and on that encounter. Not to go in defending your position, but to shed the light of the gospel on that reality. That is the mission that Francis is on about. Shedding the light of the gospel. No lights under a bushel, but they must be up on lampstands. Light reveals beauty. He talks about beauty quite a lot. Not necessarily highfalutin art beauty, but the beauty of a child's smile, the beauty of a mother's caress, the beauty of a simple meal being produced by the poor for a guest. The light reveals beauty and truth, but also casts shadows which reveal where evil and sin lurk. This is what he means by the importance of shame. The process of revealing where sin is lurking in our lives. Okay? That's an uncomfortable thing to hear, isn't it? He's not talking about, the great heavy Catholic guilt trip. No, that's not what it's about. But when you shed the light of the gospel, it reveals the nooks and the crannies where the dark stuff lurks. Not just there, but also in here. So when he talks about shame, that's what he's talking about. Not some destructive kind of understanding, but a revealing understanding. Revealing, revelation. These tensions can be, and I do have some copies of this talk, instead of something versus something, I've put something T, something. So something in tension with something. It can be continuity in tension with discontinuity, revision in tension with reform, doctrinal purity with doctrinal development, dogmatics against pastoral, the centre in tension with the margins. There's always going to need a central office for the church. It's always going to be a Vatican for the Catholic Church. But it's the tension that it has with the margins. Going back to the one about doctrinal purity and doctrinal development, okay, Francis talks more openly about the sensum fidei, the sense of the faith in and amongst the people of God, in tension with the other side of the coin, which is the magisterial teaching of the church. Yeah? All right. This is a theology of encounter rooted in the personal relationship of respect, even if in disagreement, between individuals, be they persons, institutions, or states. It distrusts top-down legalist approaches. We've seen that being inoperated in the last 10 days in this nation, this great and good nation, when a legalistic approach ended up with children being taken away from their parents and put in cages. It distrusts top-down legalist approaches. It shows a deep unwillingness to pass judgment. It encourages dialogue and is joy-filled. This word joy comes up and we're going to discuss it tomorrow. The way forward is by a slow, sometimes painfully slow, accompaniment and respect in which the light of the Gospels reveals a new path. The Gospels do it, not some clash of ideas, but the light of the Gospel reveals a new path which we can walk along with the other, not still necessarily sort of saying, we're great buddies, we've come to a complete understanding. No, we walk in difference. One of Pope Francis's greatest friends was the chief rabbi of a synagogue in Buenos Aires. Yeah? Is it Buenos Aires? Is that Brazil? Argentina. Which one's Argentina? Rio de Janeiro. Buenos Aires. Oh God! See, I don't know the South enough, do I? There we go. There's a whole. There we go. You know, and there's a lovely book of discussions between the two of them, and they have their differences, but they walk. They walk along together, revealing biblical truth to each other. Okay, yes, we have the Gospels, but he has the First Testament, and revealing it to each other. Yes, they say, yes, but don't you remember this? Don't you? And that's revealing the way forward. Great discussions take place between Muslims and Jews and Christians all over the world. We don't hear much of that, do we? We hear of the clash. Francis tells us in Evangelium 15 that this evangelizing missionary outreach is paradigmatic of all the church's activity. That means this is what we're about. Boom, boom. Full stop. Point. End of discussion. This is pure gospel imperative. In number 120, he reminds us that we're all called to be missionary disciples, and he says that a missionary heart is aware of these limits of language, culture, and circumstance, and makes itself weak with the weak, everything for everyone. 1 Corinthians 9:22. It never closes itself off, he says, never retreats into its own security, never opts for rigidity and defensiveness, and in discerning the paths of the Spirit, and so always does what good it can, even if in the process its shoes get soiled by the mud of the street. Go out to the whole world, proclaim the good news, says the gospel. The last one, getting a bit carried away here. The church as a field hospital. When the cardinals met before going into our conclave to elect the successor of Benedict XVI, like they always do, all the cardinals, the electing ones and the older ones, because they're a repository of great wisdom, even though they're not going in to elect, have the right to address the whole College of Cardinals. And Jorge Borrollo did. And he talked about that image that comes from the book of Revelation of Jesus at the door and knocking. But Francis, being Francis, was brilliant. He wasn't talking about Jesus on the outside knocking to come in, but on the inside so that we would let him out. Think of it in those terms. Jesus inside the church knocking on the door, try let me out, so that I can go to the margins. I can shed the light. He continues that sort of idea. When the church keeps Christ to herself and does not let him out, it becomes referential, and thus gets sick. The solution is to go out to the peripheries and minister to the needy. The church is a field hospital for the wounded. This is a radical call of Francis to rethink ecclesial life. Not to get stuck, but to go out. We also need to understand that the sick will not come to us. We must go out to them, like the field hospitals do in battle. When battle advances, the hospital goes on to just behind the lines so that it can heal the wounded. It goes to where the wounded are, the broken, the poor, the marginalized, the shunned. We've all got images of MASH, haven't we, in our minds at this moment? And the first, we need to find out what are their sufferings, their challenges, their hurts, and their circumstances, their reality. And the first rule of that approach must be to listen. That's what true obedience means, to listen, obedire, same root as audere in Latin. We do not go out pre-diagnosing with dogma, but we go and listen with the light of the Gospels, shining in our hearts, illuminating the wounds. This is a discernment. This is discernment. Listen, seek what is of value, and work to help to wholeness and reintegration from the sickbed back into life. We go ourselves as wounded healers. We've all got our wounds and our hurts and our broken bits, both physical, psychological, spiritual. Those of you who like the spiritual writer Henry Nouwen, one of his great works was The Wounded Healer. We go as wounded healers ourselves, not in any sense of machismo or like an omniscient doctor with the power to heal, but with a simple message of the medicine of mercy. Mercy is needed for no matter what the wounds, and must not be obstructed by obstacle courses of requirements before we give any of the medicine to anybody. I.e., a certain level of health is needed before I'm going to give you anything, and it does not require a prescription. I am not going to get into the controversy during this mission that has come from one of his other great documents, Amoris Laetitia, where the bishops are still working out. They're having this Guardinian tension of ideas about whether people who have their marriages have failed and got remarried are allowed to go to communion. Communion isn't a prize. It's not something that you earn. It is a gift from God, and it's there for our healing. It is the mercy of God made flesh and in the real presence in our lives. And if somebody's broken and are wounded, they probably need to be fed that medicine. And Francis isn't talking something new here. It's pure St. Ambrose, from over 1,000 years old. And this is what he means by not having obstacle courses and specific requirements before you can get. Okay? But he's not ruled on this. And he's actually said to some of the bishops' conferences who are starting to make their things, he said, no, that's not quite right yet. He's keeping this dynamic tension. No, we've got to get the gospel in on this, the light of the gospel. Okay? Not too defensive of our dogmatic position, and not to be too free and easy, because there is consequences to things. But we need the light of gospel to keep us going in the right direction, yeah? With each other, not against each other. The thing the church needs most today, he says, is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol or about the level of his blood sugars. See how Francis is always in the world of imagery to really hit home a point. It's wonderful. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk to him about everything else. Heal the wounds. Heal the wounds. And you have to start from the ground up, he said in an interview very early on in his pontificate. This is in line with the Acts of the Good Samaritan, who crosses the road, washes, feeds, and raises up the neighbor that he has found and doesn't ask a single question. This is the heart of the structural... this is the heart of it. And then he says the structural and organizational reforms that are necessary are secondary. That is, they come afterwards. The first reform must be of attitude. The ministers of the gospel, he says, must be people who can warm the hearts of the people, who walk through the dark night with them, who know how to dialogue and to dissent themselves into their people's dark night, into the darkness, but without getting lost. So that's why we must be convinced as the missionaries of the gospel. Because when we go out into those dark streets of the world and encounter the darkness that is there, if we have the light of the gospel shining in our hearts, we will not be lost on those roads. So that is why the light of the gospel is so important for this vision of missionary healing church. He says, we need to proclaim the gospel on every street corner, preaching the good news of the kingdom and healing, even with our preaching, every kind of disease and wound. This does not mean just keeping the doors of the church open, but going out proclaiming the saving love of God. And we must avoid losing the... I think this is wonderful. We must avoid losing the freshness and fragrance of the gospel. He's using all the senses. He's a very sensory man. Not just light and vision, okay, but also the freshness, the touch, the feel of something, and the fragrance. And he's talking about word, everything, bodily. We must walk there. We must physically do it. And it struck me when I was giving this talk this morning that we have outside this door, don't we, have the avenue of roses. They're beautiful. Only 2 of them have fragrance. And you know what it's like. Oh, nothing there. It's beautiful. Yeah. Church, lovely. You know, looks beautiful. But, oh, this one. Wow. Wow. It really just gets you. That's what Francis is about in the church. It's all right making it look like a lovely rose, but if it's got no fragrance, it's not going to go beyond itself. Fragrance gets out, doesn't it? Okay? I've got some of those very, very stinky marigolds in my garden there. Judy hates them. Judy hates them. But you walk past them and suddenly you get that big marigoldy, slightly acrid pong fragrance. I quite like it, but she doesn't. There we go. You know? If you brush through lavender, you know what I'm talking about. Okay? The fragrance gets out. You've noticed I bought a new thurible, hand thurible, fragrance. Makes you all cough, but that's beside the point. So, Francis has shown this missionary approach and this healing approach by visiting prisoners, comforting the sick, embracing the poor. There's that very powerful picture of him embracing that very physically disfigured man in there, who had the same kind of thing as, remember the film The Elephant Man? This guy also has that kind of thing. And Francis just went and embraced him when everybody else was, yeah. Hugging children and providing a shelter for the homeless in the gardens of the Vatican himself. Love, mercy and forgiveness are the medicines needed to heal the wounds of the world, but we have to take them out to the peripheries, to take the glad tidings of great joy, that word again, the Christmas message of the Incarnation, of God who comes to walk with his broken people out into those who have little or nothing. To wait in our churches to be asked, no. Let's go out to the peripheries, the margins where the oppressed reside. Mercy is our radical medicine that we take. This is incarnating the gospel imperative to go out to the whole world. Francis is taking us back to the very roots of our understanding of what it means to be church. Go and read, for your bedside reading, that little bit at the beginning of Acts, the description of the early Christians in community. We have to go out. I said at the beginning I was going to read you another poem. This one's called, the other one's called Closed Church. This one's called A Dream Church. This is the church of my dreams, the church of the warm heart, the open mind, the adventurous spirit, the church that cares, that heals hurt lives, that comforts old people, that challenges youth, that knows no divisions of culture and class, no frontiers, geographical or social. The church that inquires as well as affirms, that looks forward as well as backward. The church of the Master, the church of the people. High as the ideals of Jesus, low as the humblest human. A working church, a worshipping church, a winsome church. A church that interprets truth in terms of truth, that inspires courage for this life and hope for the life to come. A church of courage, a church of all good people, the church of the living God. When you leave, I want you to do something physical. As you go out, whichever door it is, I want you to and go out. Because remember, Christ abides in you and abides in the one the other side of that door. And he's desperate to get us to go out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out.